The year is 1945. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, has just ended. Millions lie dead, entire cities are in ruins, and the world yearns for peace. Yet from the ashes of this global conflict arises a new struggle, a confrontation unlike any before it. The Cold War. It was a clash of ideologies, a global standoff between two superpowers. The United States, a champion of democracy and capitalism, and the Soviet Union, a communist state advocating for a socialist world order. This was not a war fought on traditional battlefields with tanks and troops. Instead, it was a war of espionage, propaganda, technological one-upmanship, and the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. Imagine a world on constant edge where the threat of nuclear war loomed large. The Cold War was a period of intense geopolitical tension, a time when the fate of the world hung in the balance. This essay will delve into the history of this tumultuous era, exploring its key events, the ideologies that fueled it, and the lasting impact it has had on the world we live in today. The seeds of the Cold War were sown even before the guns fell silent in World War II. The devastation of the war left Europe in ruins, and the power vacuum created a fertile ground for new conflicts to emerge. As the Allies celebrated their hard-won victory, the underlying tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to surface. The wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union, while crucial to defeating Nazi Germany, masked deep-seated ideological and geopolitical differences. These differences were temporarily set aside in the face of a common enemy, but they were never truly resolved. The US and the USSR had fundamentally different visions for the future, and these visions were bound to clash once the immediate threat of the Axis powers was removed. The US, with its capitalist economy and democratic ideals, stood in stark contrast to the communist Soviet Union, a totalitarian state with a centrally planned economy. The American way of life, characterized by individual freedoms and market-driven prosperity, was diametrically opposed to the Soviet model, which emphasized state control and collective ownership. This ideological divide was not just a matter of policy, it was a fundamental difference in how each society viewed the world and their place in it.
The US, wary of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin's ambitions and distrustful of his communist ideology, saw the USSR as a threat to its vision of a free and democratic world. American leaders were particularly concerned about Stalin's intentions in Eastern Europe, where Soviet influence was rapidly expanding. The fear was that communism would spread beyond the borders of the USSR, undermining democratic institutions and threatening global stability.
The two superpowers had very different visions for the post-war world order. The United States envisioned a world where democracy and capitalism could flourish, believing that these systems would lead to peace and prosperity. In contrast, the Soviet Union sought to expand its sphere of influence, promoting communism as the path to a just and equitable society. These competing visions were not just abstract ideas, they were the driving forces behind the foreign policies of both nations. The US sought to promote democracy and capitalism globally, while the USSR aimed to expand its sphere of influence and spread communist ideology. This was evident in the Marshall Plan, through which the US provided economic aid to help rebuild Western Europe, aiming to create strong, stable democracies that could resist communist influence. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was consolidating its control over Eastern Europe, establishing communist governments loyal to Moscow.
This fundamental clash of ideologies, coupled with mutual suspicion and distrust, laid the foundation for the Cold War. Both sides engaged in a relentless propaganda war, each portraying the other as the ultimate evil. Diplomatic efforts were often overshadowed by espionage, covert operations, and a constant readiness for military confrontation. The world was divided into two camps, each led by a superpower determined to assert its dominance. As the war drew to a close, the uneasy alliance between the two superpowers began to unravel. The celebrations of victory were short-lived as the reality of post-war reconstruction set in. The US and the USSR found themselves on opposite sides of a rapidly widening ideological divide. The cooperation that had been necessary to defeat a common enemy was no longer enough to bridge the gap between their conflicting visions for the future. The wartime collaboration that had once bound them together gave way to mistrust and suspicion, setting the stage for a new era of global confrontation. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences, which had aimed to shape the post-war world, instead highlighted the deep divisions between the Allies. Agreements made in the spirit of cooperation were soon broken. and the world stood on the brink of a new and dangerous conflict, the Cold War.
As the Red Army swept across Eastern Europe, liberating nations from Nazi rule, it left behind communist governments in its wake. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, saw this as an opportunity to expand its influence and secure its borders against any future threats. The liberation was not just a military victory, but also a political maneuver to establish a buffer zone of friendly governments. These Soviet-backed regimes, often installed through coercion and manipulation, effectively extended Soviet influence across Eastern Europe. Elections were held, but they were far from free or fair. The Soviet Union ensured that communist parties would dominate the political landscape, often through intimidation and outright fraud. This created a series of puppet states that were loyal to Moscow. This division of Europe, solidified by what Winston Churchill famously termed the Iron Curtain, marked the beginning of the Cold War in earnest. Churchill's speech highlighted the stark contrast between the democratic West and the communist East, drawing a clear line that would define global politics for decades. The Iron Curtain was not just a metaphor, it was a real and tangible divide that affected millions of lives. On one side stood the Western Bloc, led by the United States and its allies in Western Europe. These nations banded together to form NATO, a military alliance aimed at countering Soviet aggression. The Western Bloc promoted values of democracy, individual freedoms, and market economies, contrasting sharply with the communist ideology of the East. On the other side stood the Eastern Bloc, dominated by the Soviet Union and its satellite states. These countries were bound together by the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance that served as a counterbalance to NATO. Life in the Eastern Bloc was characterized by state control over many aspects of daily life, from the economy to personal freedoms.
The Iron Curtain was not merely a physical barrier, it represented a deep ideological divide that separated East from West. This divide was evident in the propaganda disseminated by both sides, each portraying the other as the enemy. The Iron Curtain symbolized the struggle between two competing worldviews, one based on totalitarian control and the other on democratic freedoms. The flow of information, people, and goods between the two blocs was severely restricted. Border checkpoints were heavily guarded, and crossing from one side to the other was fraught with danger. Families were separated and communication was limited, creating a sense of isolation and mistrust that permeated both sides of the divide. Eastern Europe, under the grip of Soviet control, became a region shrouded in secrecy and fear. Surveillance was widespread, and dissent was brutally suppressed. The KGB and other security agencies kept a tight grip on the population, ensuring that any opposition to the regime was swiftly dealt with. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and repression. The West viewed these developments with growing alarm. Leaders in the United States and Western Europe saw the spread of communism as a direct threat to their way of life. Protests and political cartoons in the West often depicted the Soviet Union as a menacing force, highlighting the ideological battle that was taking place. The Soviet Union's actions were seen as a direct threat to the balance of power in Europe and to the principles of freedom and democracy that the US and its allies sought to uphold. In response, the West bolstered its military presence in Europe, established new alliances, and engaged in a series of political and economic measures aimed at containing Soviet influence. This set the stage for a prolonged and tense standoff that would define the latter half of the 20th century.
Section 4. The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. These two pivotal policies were instrumental in shaping the geopolitical landscape of the post-World War II era. In response to the growing Soviet influence, the United States adopted a policy of containment. This strategy was designed to curb the spread of communism and limit Soviet power.
This policy, articulated in the Truman Doctrine of 1947, aimed to prevent the further spread of communism. President Harry S. Truman declared that the United States would support free peoples who were resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. The Truman Doctrine pledged U.S. support for any country threatened by communist expansion. This was a significant shift in American foreign policy, marking the beginning of a more active and interventionist approach.
Following this doctrine, the U.S. implemented the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid package aimed at rebuilding war-torn Europe. Named after Secretary of State George C. Marshall, this plan was officially known as the European Recovery Program.
The Marshall Plan was not just an act of humanitarian generosity, it was a strategic move to counteract the influence of the Soviet Union in Europe. It was a strategic move to bolster Western European economies and prevent the spread of communism by fostering stability and prosperity. The plan provided over $12 billion in economic assistance to help rebuild European economies.
The Marshall Plan was a resounding success. It not only helped to rebuild the infrastructure of Europe, but also revitalized its economies. It helped to revitalize the economies of Western Europe, making them less susceptible to communist influence. The economic stability brought about by the Marshall Plan was crucial in preventing the spread of communism in the region.
The Soviet Union, seeing the Marshall Plan as a threat to its own sphere of influence, refused to allow its satellite states to participate. This decision further deepened the divide between the East and the West. This further solidified the division of Europe and intensified the rivalry between the two superpowers. The construction of the Berlin Wall became a stark symbol of this division.
The Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan marked a turning point in the Cold War, signaling the beginning of a long and costly struggle between the US and the USSR. These policies not only defined the early years of the Cold War, but also set the stage for the geopolitical dynamics that would dominate the latter half of the 20th century. The impact of these policies extended beyond immediate economic and military support. They laid the groundwork for the formation of NATO and other alliances that would shape global politics for decades to come. The legacy of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan is evident in the enduring alliances and the ongoing efforts to maintain global stability. These initiatives were not just responses to the immediate post-war challenges, but were visionary steps towards a more structured and cooperative international order. Today, the principles behind these policies continue to influence international relations, reminding us of the importance of strategic foresight and collaborative efforts in addressing global challenges. Section 5. Brinkmanship and the nuclear threat. The Cold War was not just a battle of ideologies and political influence. It was also a terrifying arms race, a relentless pursuit of military superiority.
Both the US and the USSR poured vast resources into developing ever more powerful weapons, including nuclear bombs. This arms race, driven by fear and mistrust, created a climate of constant anxiety and brought the world perilously close to nuclear war on several occasions.
One of the most dangerous manifestations of this brinkmanship was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The crisis began when the Soviet Union, in a secret operation, deployed nuclear-armed missiles to Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
This provocative move, perceived as a direct threat to U.S. national security, triggered a tense 13-day standoff between the U.S. and the USSR.